Yes.
Good. Okay, so I just want to make a few remarks on the last two propositions in Book 2 in order to wrap things up, and then we'll pass it over to Blake. The first of these, Proposition 48, is straightforward, unsurprising. In the mind, there is no absolute or free will, but the mind is determined to will this or that by a cause, which is also determined by another, and this again by another, and so to infinity. So he's just reprising here the idea that the will, like the intellect, is part of natura naturata, meaning that it's governed by causal determinism. He's already stated this in Proposition 31 of Book 1, and in the immediately preceding propositions, where he says that any finite mode, in this case a mode in the attribute of thought, is the product of an infinite sequence of an infinite causal chain. Remember, that's what he means by natura naturata, whereas natura naturans refers to God's essence. So the immediate consequence of Proposition 31 in Book 1 was to rule out the idea of free will for God, but exactly the same reasoning rules it out for man. And he, in the scholium to Proposition 48, he just mentions the argument that he gave in the appendix of Part 1. He actually presents more than one argument against human free will, but this one I think is the most memorable. It's where he says that men imagine that they act by freedom of the will because they are conscious of their actions, but they are unaware of the causes that determine them to act in one way or the other. So they imagine that their actions come about by an exercise of freedom of the will. It's simply a placeholder for the causes that they are ignorant of. In the scholium, he says that the same is true of understanding, desiring, and loving. There is no faculty of will or a faculty of understanding or desiring or loving. And his perspective here is that these and similar faculties are either complete fictions or nothing but metaphysical beings or universals. Okay, we've seen over the last couple of weeks that Spinoza is extremely skeptical about universals. So his view is that there are such things as volitions, but there is no such thing as a faculty of will, let alone free will. So intellect and will are to this or that idea, or to this or that volition, as stoneness, this abstract universal, is to this or that stone, or as man is to the individuals, Peter or Paul. Okay, so there's nothing really new here. The Proposition 49, on the other hand, does take a little bit of work to decipher. Let me read it first. In the mind, there is no volition or affirmation and negation except that which the idea involves insofar as it is an idea. It turns out that what's going on here is that he is in a dialogue with Descartes, even though he doesn't mention Descartes by name. And in fact, this dialogue is going to continue into the beginning of book 3, where he's going to take issue with Descartes' ideas about passions and his mind-body dualism. So let me just read these passages here. From the scholium of the previous proposition, okay, Spinoza says, he gives a definition of will, which is going to appear rather surprising. He says, by will, I understand a faculty of affirming and denying and not desire. I say that I understand the faculty by which the mind affirms or denies something true or something false, and not the desire by which the mind wants a thing or avoids it. So the first point to make here is that throughout the rest of the ethics, he is scarcely going to mention will at all. He's going to talk at great length about desire and about conatus, but not about will. Second, he's reprising here an implicit definition from Descartes. Here I've dug up a quote of Descartes, who says, I assign the act of judging itself, which consists simply in assenting, i.e. in affirmation or denial, to the determination of the will rather than to the perception of the intellect. So this is what Spinoza is disputing in the statement of this proposition. But to understand what's going on here, okay, I found that what I had to do was dig into the history of this question as laid out by Wolfson. So we're going to have a little historical digression, and then we'll come back to understanding what Spinoza is actually talking about here. It goes all the way back to Aristotle. Aristotle distinguished between what he called theoretical reason and practical reason. Spinoza, by the way, does not have that distinction. There's only one type of reason for Spinoza. So theoretical reason is God's contemplation of himself, and practical reason is our reasoning about the things we need to do in order to achieve the things we want to achieve in life. And Aristotle said that in order for the deliverances of practical reason to have, for us to take them on board, we needed an adjunct faculty of the will, okay, to assent or deny the deliverances of practical reason, something that would sort of give practical reason an extra oomph in order to get us to act in one way or the other. So will was something that Aristotle assigned to man, but not to God. And later, Augustine decided that, oh, if we make this will free, then we have a solution to the problem of evil. And then eventually, Christian theology attributed the will to God as well. Now, we've already seen how Spinoza rejected this, okay? Basically, he denied free will to God, basically on the grounds that divine perfection would require that if things happened as a result of an exercise of divine free will, then God's will would have to be immutable. Okay, God couldn't change his mind. and things couldn't actually ever happen. That in the Scholium to Proposition 33 in Book 1, that is the argument that Spinoza gives for rejecting the idea that God has free will. So he assigns will and intellect to natura naturata rather than to God's essence. Okay, now coming to this business of how will is understood as a faculty of affirming and denying, that turns out to have its origin with Thomas Aquinas. Okay, Aquinas said that the will, the way he construed it, was that, well, in the same way as Aristotle, but it was a faculty of judgment. Okay, so the practical reason delivers an idea to the mind, and then the mind, through this faculty of judgment, it chooses freely to assent to the idea or to withhold assent. And that supposedly was how free will worked, or how it was supposed to work in medieval theology. And this is exactly the view that Descartes is stating here. So the point then that Spinoza is making is that he is going to deny that there is this supplementary faculty of judgment. Okay, he says that there is no volition or affirmation or negation. There is no affirmation or negation except that which the idea involves insofar as it is an idea. The affirmation or negation is already contained in the idea for Spinoza. There's no extra judging going on. So he's already anticipated this in this axiom. There are no modes of thinking, okay, such as love, desire, or whatever, is designated by the word effects of the mind, unless there is in the same individual the idea of the thing loved, desired, etc. For Spinoza, the modes under the attribute of thought are just ideas. And these ideas, okay, are effectively qualified so that you get the affects of love or desire or whatever, okay, but the picture that Spinoza is now going to develop in book 3 is that all ideas are effectively charged, okay, and there's no need, and he thinks of ideas as forces operating in the mind, analogous to the way that emotions can be thought of as forces, because they come in varying degrees of intensity and may be in conflict with each other. So this is the picture that he's going to develop in book 3. We've come to statements like where he says that a true idea cannot be overridden. A false idea cannot be overridden by a true idea merely in virtue of the fact that the idea is true, but only if the idea has sufficient force to overcome the false idea. Just as we believe, as we often say that we talk about degrees of belief, okay? We are more or less confident in our beliefs. For Spinoza, ideas are more or less forceful, just as emotions are more or less forceful. And, one emotion, he says, can only be overcome by another emotion. And for Spinoza, we'll see that reason itself is effective. The way that reason is effective against the emotions is because uh, reason itself and the pleasure we take in reasoning is itself an emotion. Okay, so this is just setting the stage for book 3. And the thing to remember is that although Spinoza is going to talk at length about desire as one of the primary emotions, he will say virtually nothing henceforth about will. So the only other thing that remains is there's a lengthy scholium to proposition 14.9, which comes in 2 parts. The first part, Spinoza sets out to rebut several arguments that the medievals might have advanced against his proposition 49. But it doesn't seem to me to be of anything except of historical interest, since this Cartesian way of looking at the will is purely of historical interest. Not even Christian apologists seem to be attached to this way of construing the supposed faculty of the will. The other part of the scholium is a bit more interesting, okay, because it's essentially an appendix to book 2, where he briefly sketches how his ethical project is going to unfold. These themes that he mentions here are not actually going to be developed until book 4, until he's got through the theory of the emotions. But if you've never seen book 4 or book 5, it's well worth having a look at these passages to understand the 30,000-foot picture of how Spinoza's argument is going to develop. So I'll just touch on a few of these briefly, and then we'll pass it over to Blake. He mentions, okay, so his intention is to indicate how much knowledge of this doctrine of his, essentially his necessitarianism, is to our advantage in life. Jenny, did you have a question? If so, Blake, Jenny will need to unmute if.
Okay, yeah, got it.
I don't know if you noticed. Can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you noticed in the chat, there may be a bomber in here somehow. There are 99.
No, they've already been kicked out, Ginny. They've already been kicked out.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
Good. Good riddance. Okay, just a few points then. Okay, the first point he makes, we act only from God's command. This is the, if you like, the inevitable consequence of not having free will. Okay, our actions, all of our actions are determined by the necessity of the divine nature. We share in the divine nature, and we do this the more perfect our actions are, and the more we understand God. So this doctrine, in addition to giving us complete peace of mind, also teaches us wherein our greatest happiness or blessedness consists, namely in the knowledge of God alone. So this is his first invocation of this word blessedness or beatitude, which is the theme of Book 5. His doctrine teaches us that we must bear calmly both good fortune and bad. All things follow from the necessity of the divine nature. And of course, he uses his favorite mathematical analogy to drive that point home here. He will develop this into an ethical doctrine as this is usually understood. Okay, that is to say, how we should behave towards each other. This doctrine contributes to social life insofar as it teaches us to hate no one, to disesteem no one, to mock no one, to be angry at no one, to envy no one. And also insofar as it teaches us that each of us should be content with his own things, should be helpful to his neighbor, and all the, as you would expect, all of the usual recommendations of an ethical teaching. But with the difference that for Spinoza, everything is from the guidance of reason. He's going to say that reason makes no demands which are contrary to nature. So in Book 3, we'll see how he's going to ground his whole ethical doctrine in this principle of the conatus, which is the endeavor to persist in being and to flourish. And eventually he will develop it into a political philosophy, just as Aristotle wrote his politics after he finished with his ethics. That was Spinoza's idea as well, although his political treatise was never finished. Good. So that brings us to the end of Book 2. I can, I guess, cancel the share unless there are any questions about this. Alex, did you have a question? Blake, you will need to unmute Alex.
Get it.
Yeah, got it. Thanks, thanks, Blake, and thanks, Patrick, for this. Yeah, I was very curious. You mentioned the connection here with necessitarianism, and I guess I'm getting the same intuition as well. It's interesting. I guess it leaves me wondering with the question of this, I suppose our attitude towards perception. You know, if we don't think of ourselves as, you know, ultimate judges of what I take to be true or false, instead it's as if perception kind of takes us on a, itself shows us what is true and false. So I suppose that's kind of a part of the Spinoza's attitude here.
Well, yeah, I think he would perhaps favor the word understanding. Okay, the more accurate our understanding of, well, God, of course, is just nature, including ourselves, the greater the degree of our understanding of our situation, the more, in Spinoza's view, we will willingly conform to this necessitarian picture that he's outlining. But it's a practice for Spinoza. It's not something that, it's not passive, it's active. And he's going to keep on stressing the need for the mind to be active in its endeavor to understand.
Mm.
So it's not perception in the sense of, well, it might be perception in the sense that William Blake used when Blake talked about, he said he saw through the eye, not with it. Okay, it was for Blake an activity of the, well, he called it the imagination, which happens to rub strangely against Spinoza's use of the word imagination. But the point is that it's an activity. The mind's striving to understand is what leads to what he calls the greatest happiness or blessedness, rather than a passive perception.
Right. Yeah, what I find really interesting is how this activity, you know, this power of understanding, of intellect, is it's as if it's one and the same with the necessity of nature, right? And it's very different from, you know, another picture which would say, well, my power is, let's say, my free will, my ability to
Yeah.
act independently.
Yeah. He does say of God that God's power and God's essence are one and the same thing. And for man, he talks about the power of activity as the thing which, well, is what he calls the actual essence, or the conatus. And in practice, of course, what he means by activity is the activity of understanding more than physical activity. Although he says that the mind and body are in one-to-one correspondence, in practice, he's going to talk about the mind more than the body, and the activity of understanding rather than physical activity.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. James?
Yeah, well, you talked about the conatus and the ideas and understanding. You mentioned emotion. Emotion is like
Mm-hmm.
like the power of reason, or are they different?
What I meant to say was that for Spinoza, we see this in book 3. We haven't seen it yet. We see it in book 3 that cognition and emotion are two sides of the same coin. Okay? That all of our ideas looked at under the attribute of extension are emotions. So they are motions of the body. And the Spinoza thinks of ideas as being almost like physical forces in the mind. We've already seen that for Spinoza, we are not unitary bodies or unitary minds. We're composite bodies. We're made up of a sort of congeries of diverse forces and drives that need to be reconciled with each other. And until we have developed the power of reason, they may be at odds with each other. But you see, Spinoza has swept the board. He's taken out all of the faculties that we typically attribute to the mind, such as a faculty of will. Okay, he says there are just ideas in the mind, and these ideas are effectively charged, and the challenge for human flourishing is to figure out how to get these ideas, these drives, working harmoniously with each other. I may have gone off track a bit, James. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question at this point. Can you unmute James, Blake? Because
Yeah, I think it's safe to unmute everybody.
if you can, Blake, do unmute everybody at
Yeah,
this
so
point.
you're saying that there's a kind of these emotions are there, and maybe it's represented by the body, and then there's the mind representing reason and understanding, and so
Well, they're just two sides of the same coin.
Okay, so
the two attributes. Okay,
right.
two ways of looking at the same thing
Right.
for Spinoza.
And the whole idea is to reconcile them.
Well, within say in our emotional lives, we are continually being buffeted by conflicting emotions, and the the role of reason is to harmonize these. But for Spinoza, reason itself is going to be emotionally charged. He denies that any you can't think your way out of an emotion. He says that only an emotion can overcome another emotion. So we're going to see all of this developed in book 3. This last proposition, it's just a bridge towards book 3, the proposition 49, where he denies these faculties and says that, in fact, under the attribute of thought, all there are ideas. Okay, under the attribute of extension, okay, we have modifications of the body, and emotions can be looked on in either way. Okay, they are modifications of the body together with ideas that we have about the causes of these modifications. I guess, it's sort of premature to ramble on about this at this point, because we're now at the threshold of book 3, and Blake will give us an overview of that tonight.